Hello everyone, this is your host Professor Reha here with the class examination of the Spellbinder, the combination of the Arcanist and the Necromancer. Now this video is intended to help those who are looking to improv the Spellbinder, don't have any items for the Spellbinder, or alternatively are looking to kind of craft their own builds using some of the ideas that I put forth here. Now there are four broad ways of building a Spellbinder. There's a pet focus, there's an elemental focus, and then there's two different versions of Aether focus, one in which your secondary damage type is vitality, and the other of which your secondary damage type is elemental damage. Now, the first one I want to talk about is actually the pet, because it's the most straightforward, because obviously if you're running a full pet Spellbinder, you're looking for Master of Death, you're looking for the full Skeletons, you're looking for the full Blight Fiend, usually used as a tank. I don't usually go Unstable Anomaly when I'm going full pet here. And then I'm almost always going Escondra's Elemental Exchange with maxed Manifestation, so that way my pets do much more elemental damage, which can really help. Now, where you go from here at this point really depends on if you want to be a ranged pet Spellbinder or a melee one. If you're a melee one, whether or not you use two-handed weapons, that's totally up to you. But Bone Harvest is obviously, of course, an excellent choice. Now, whether or not you decide to go into Spectral Binding and Spectral Wrath is entirely up to you. That is a totally different question. But if you're melee, Bone Harvest is an excellent ability, obviously. Definitely worth considering. But if you're ranged, instead what might be, in fact, potentially more useful is Flash Freeze. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, wait a minute, hold on. Ranged with Flash Freeze? Yeah, this is an absolutely huge radius. When you max this, that is 16 meters. That is a fairly large distance. So even if you're not right on the front lines, this has impressive reach. And keep in mind that your Skeleton Mages, however many you happen to have, which is randomly determined, but your Skeleton Mages do fire damage. So, by maxing Alexa's Flash Freeze, you are, in fact, allowing them to do far more damage. And I may be wondering, well, what about Absolute Zero? Is this useful? Conditionally, yes. If you decide to go Absolute Zero, and you can use this melee as well, I just prefer to use this ranged because this helps with the survivability of your front line, which obviously is supposed to be keeping the enemy away from you. So this is equally as effective in melee. It's just not going to impact your skeleton survivability as much because you're right there with them. There's a couple of other options you have. But if you decide to go Absolute Zero, which is an option, don't go into Manifestation, because Manifestation is converting that physical damage to elemental damage, which is actually not what you want under these circumstances. If you're going to go into Absolute Zero, leave Manifestation out of this. So you do have to kind of make a decision there. Do I want to use Manifestation? Do I not want to use Manifestation? At that point, that's what it basically is going to come down to. So those are really the two primary skills in which I'll run. Now, maybe I'll run a couple of other things as well, because if you have been paying attention, you will have noticed that this is not exactly a huge amount of point investment here for the full pet build so far. You go all the way with Elemental Balance. Although, to be fair, this will just increase the elemental damage of your pets either way. To be fair, this seems like it would be quite expensive, but you still have quite a few points to work with, especially when you consider that you won't be maxing Arcanist, right? So keep that. Well, you normally won't be maxing Arcanist. I have done that a couple of times. So you've got 20 points to work with, and we can reasonably pull back this many points here, so we get to at least Elemental Balance. So you can absolutely go into Alexa's Flash Freeze for your ranged, if you want, and then you have a couple of different options. If you want to boost yourself a little bit, maybe you go into Inner Focus and Maven's Sphere. Maybe you still want Bone Harvest to some extent. You can absolutely go into that. Maybe you want to go melee with Alexa's Flash Freeze, and you bust out Spectral Binding and Spectral Wrath for that decrease in vitality and physical damage and Aether damage as well. Totally up to you. But you've got some nice options, especially if you really pull back on the Arcanist levels as well. But I almost always am going to use Escondra's if I'm going full pets, and then what kind of accent skill you choose is entirely up to you, your personal playstyle and what weapon you're using. But if I am melee, I'm usually going Bone Harvest. It doesn't reach far enough with ranged, so I don't usually use it with ranged, but Alexa's Flash Freeze has amazing range. Even if you're melee, you're still going to hit the enemy front line at the very least, and if you're standing close enough to the front line where you're still, like, you're right behind your skeletons, but not actually in melee range, you might even be able to hit the back line, but that depends on how aggressively you play as a ranged character. I play pretty aggressively as a ranged character, as you may have noticed if you've been watching my Grim Dawn run-through, so I can usually hit a respectable amount of the enemy backline with Alexa's Flash Freeze, because I'm a very aggressive ranged player. But you may not be, and that's totally fine. As long as you're close enough to hit the enemy front line, which with 16 meters you're going to be, you're pretty much fine. So, that's some things you can think about. I don't normally go into a whole lot of other ones. First off, Panetti's Replicating Missile is somewhat unnecessary, especially if you're ranged, because you already have your pets, and when you are running a pet build, especially if you're using a Necromancer pet build, because you are reviving your pets every so often, it's potentially dangerous to use something that you can spam energy with. Panetti's Replicating Missile is spammable. Albrecht's Aether Ray is spammable. These cost large amounts of energy for continuous use over time. These are the main ones that I avoid, but you can also, if you're going to go into Calidor's Tempest, I almost always recommend Wrath of Agrivix, not even necessarily for the damage, but just to force a recharge, so you don't fall into the habit of spamming this, because for a skeleton-focused pet build, once you hit ultimate, you'll find that skeletons die. Roughly every fight you're going to lose a couple of skeletons, and you're going to want to revive them, and that's expensive, and it can get expensive, let me rephrase that. It's not initially expensive for one skeleton revive or whatever, but you come up against an enemy that has a strong enough AoE damage effect, and you're going to find yourself reviving your skeletons a lot against certain boss fights. A really easy example would be Krieg, the first time you fight Krieg in his laboratory. That's a very ugly fight for pet builds, because he can usually do some considerable damage to your pets in that fight, even if they're a decent distance away, and you just spend a lot of time resurrecting skeletons. So having a spammable ability tends to hurt, because if you're like me, you can fall into this trap of spamming this ability and then running out of energy. So if you're going to go with a perfectly viable Calidor's Tempest, put Wrath of Agrivix on so you have some automatic built-in self-control. Besides the fact the knockback helps your frontline survive. Again, this is usually for melee. I don't usually use Calidor's Tempest with range, especially with pets, because the pets are defending you. But if you're melee, this can be a great option. This can be absolutely fantastic, especially if you decide to combine it with Spectral Binding. So, you have options here, but usually I'm going to go with Alexa's Flash Freeze for ranged or Bone Harvest for melee. It is possible to use Drain Essence very effectively with pets, because the enemy is generally going to be locked down, especially bosses and heroes, very effective with this. But that really depends on, again, how you feel like building. Totally up to you. But that's generally how I approach pet builds. Again, Ravenous Earth is just delicious. But I would primarily, again, this is I forgot to mention, this is a skill spam, though. This is a spam, so this is somewhat risky to use, because you're going to want to drain that health. And this one's probably the most egregious example, because this is healing you, so if you're in a bad spot, and your pets start dying, and the enemy boss, say, does an AoE attack, and you get hit, oh no, I'm dying, let me use my Drain Essence, now you don't have the energy to necessarily revive your skeletons, and this becomes a sort of self-defeating trap that you get yourself into, and it gets very ugly very quickly if you're not paying attention. And it's very easy to just slip into holding down the key to use this whatever skill. So I just generally tend to avoid these as much as possible and go with something with a recharge. Just be careful with that, especially with pet builds. But now let's talk about elemental builds, because primarily the Necromancer doesn't necessarily have, initially, at first glance, a whole lot of interaction with elemental builds, but you would be somewhat mistaken. You see, if you run Star Pact, you have quite a few interesting options. I don't know why I said that with a Mario accent for a second there. So if you're going Star Pact, obviously Trozan's Sky Shard, right? Frozen Core. You actually want Drain Essence, Grave Chill, Hungering Reach, Decomposition. Alright? Maybe you use Necrotic Edge, maybe you don't. It really depends on if you want to incorporate auto attacks. That's totally up to you. Now, what I tend to do, because I find it personally very effective, is I actually run a very specific build here. I'll go full Drain Essence, right? Full Drain Essence. Trozan's Sky Shard. Shattered Star, what the heck. I can always pull that out if I decide against it later on. Alexis Flash Freeze. Maven Sphere. Inner Focus. Pull these back, actually. Necrotic Edge. Scoundrel's Elemental Exchange, and Overload. Now, what is all this? Well, there's a couple of very specific reasons why I usually run this. Now, first off, Trozan's Sky Shard is absolutely fantastic for pretty much any situation. If you don't need healing, you're spamming Trozan's Sky Shard. The basic idea is you freeze the enemy, right? Throw down the Sky Shard, start slapping the enemy with your auto attacks. Whether you're melee or ranged, does not matter. You start going after them with autos. Alright? Keep on freezing them. Freeze, freeze, freeze. Trozan's Sky Shard if you don't need healing. If you do need healing, Drain Essence, because this will heal you a really respectable amount. It also offers you vitality damage, so even if the enemy is resistant to elemental damage, most of the time, with some exceptions of certain heroes and bosses, they aren't going to be resisting the vitality damage with your cold damage and your lightning damage. So this really can get around a lot of the problems generally present in elemental builds, where, oh no, I'm fighting ethereals, I am now nerfed, basically. Nope, not today. Yes, this does cold damage, but most of this is vitality. This does vitality. This does this does not do vitality, but this gives you increased crits. But this does vitality. So this is primarily vitality, and cold is an afterthought. But that's what you want here, because you do want that kind of alternative damage type. So I love Drain Essence with the Grave Chill, and you basically just have a response to any kind of situation. I'm fighting a single target, alright, I'm using Frozen Core from Trozan's Sky Shard, and between Sky Shards, I'm slapping them with my regular attacks. I'm using Necrotic Edge here. Maybe I'm confusing them. I'm getting extra damage with this Scoundrel's Elemental Exchange. Oh, I'm facing a group? Alright, I'm going to Alexis Flash Freeze, open with a Sky Shard, and I'm either going to use regular autos, or I'm going to drain their essence if I need the healing. You've got a response to every situation, you have an alternate damage type, you have really good spirit and offensive ability, you have increased damage absorption. I just hit my mic, I apologize. You've got everything you need, and this is actually one of my favorite ways to build the Spellbinder. I love this to pieces. This is just an afterthought point. It's not really important that you have elemental balance. Yes, the crit damage increase is nice, it's not strictly necessary. If you really want to maximize elemental balance, you can drop the points out of Necrotic Edge. I just really prefer Necrotic Edge because that confusion, even though you're only using Necrotic Edge 26% of the time, the confusion can sometimes save your life, especially if you're a melee. If you're ranged, it's probably more worthwhile to go with elemental balance. But if you're melee, it's usually more worthwhile to use Necrotic Edge. It just gives you a little bit of extra damage to enemy groups if you're in the middle of a messy situation with grouped enemies. So this is something of a more specific build. I don't usually get so specific with improv, but this is just one of my favorite ways of building the Spellbinder personally, and it just works so well. I just really wanted to bring that up very specifically. So that is absolutely huge. You could also, if you wanted to, this is something I have done. I'm not hugely fond of it, but instead of going with Drain Essence, you can take these points and go into the Skeletons Instead, if you really wanted to, and then just enhance, it's basically the pet build, but instead of going for the Blight Fiend and Master of Death, you're going for Trozan's Sky Shard and Star Pact. Trozan's Sky Shard is primarily used for just supporting your skeletons, freezing enemies, doing extra damage, etc. It's not a huge difference from the pet build. Again, it's just swapping the Blight Fiend for Trozan's Sky Shard and Master of Death for Star Pact. So if you're unsure, this actually is one of the reasons I love this class, because you can go into a Spellbinder intending to improv, and you have absolutely no idea if you want to go full pets, if you want to go half pets, you don't know what you want to do, but it's a fairly safe bet to just, alright, I don't know what I want to do, I can put some points into Escondra's, and I know 2 rough builds at least. I have 2 build ideas generally in my head where Escondra's works. I can put some points in Inner Focus, that's pretty safe. I can put some points into Electra's Flash Freeze, that's pretty safe. And then from here, well, do I want skeletons? I mean, it's not a bad idea to put points in here, you know, it works. Okay, cool. That's fantastic. You know, I'll put some points in here. Well, you know, keep putting points in here. Do I want to stick with the skeletons? I mean, at the end of the day, you can also re-skill, respec or whatever, but if you're unsure of where you want to take your build, you're kind of like, well, I've got a couple of ideas, I'm not sure. You know, safe bets is Escondra's, Electra's, Inner Focus, and the skeletons. These earlier skills that you can then, as you go into the game and you start finding items, if you're improving, or if you are equipping items you already have set aside, now you're starting to kind of formulate your build. Okay, I want to go full pets, I'll go Blight Fiend instead of Trozan's. Or, you know, I'm really feeling the elemental build, let me go Trozan's, and maybe I'll pull the points out of the skeletons and go into Drain Essence, maybe I'll leave them. Who knows? I mean, it's a fairly safe bet for improving. But now we're going to get into the 2 different varieties of Aether damage, and when I'm going Aether-focused Spellbinder, I'm usually going to go with the Elemental, because you can go into Reckless Power, you have Devastation you can run, you have Albrecht's Aether Ray, which is really nice and powerful. There's 2 different ways I actually approach a Reckless Power version. First off, I will sometimes go into Devastation, Fabric of Reality, go into Tainted Power here, and then go into Spectral Wrath. Sometimes instead of Devastation, I'll go with Kalidor's Tempest, which is equally as effective. It's a little bit more costly point-wise, but it also can work. And then I'll go into Spectral Binding, and maybe I'll go into Ravenous Earth, but it's not very often. And I'll just run Spectral Binding here. There's a variation of this for the Vitality one too, and then I'll just kind of run with whatever I want. Inner Focus, Maven Sphere, maybe I do Kalidor's Tempest additionally with Devastation, maybe I do that. Perfectly possible. It's just, this is the kind of weird way, but what this offers you very specifically, if you decide to go for the Splash of Chaos with the fire and the everything else, what does this offer you that a standard Aether Elemental build doesn't is so many different damage types. You're doing a little bit of elemental damage. You've got the fire, you've got the lightning, you've got some Aether damage, you've got some chaos damage, you've got vitality damage. You're doing 4 different types of damage, and you're reducing resistances to at least the Aether and the vitality portions via Spectral Wrath. Now I prefer to play this melee. I use the Albrecht's Aether Ray as my ranged response. Devastation is useful at a distance or on yourself. And then Kalidor's Tempest with Inferno and Wrath of Agravix blast enemies away from you if you need breathing room. It works surprisingly well. Again, you are kind of diversifying your damage output a little bit here, so you're not really quite hyper-focusing on one specific damage type, which technically is maximum damage. But you do have better responses to more enemies. You're not going to be weak to ethereals because you have more than just your Aether and elemental damage. You're not going to be weak to chthonics because you don't just have chaos and vitality damage. You can respond to pretty much anything in the game with this and do respectable to excellent amounts of damage depending on what you have equipped. This does require an offhand, obviously, but this is a fairly interesting way of playing this particular idea. Alternatively, of course, you skip on the Tainted Power, you skip on the Fabric of Reality, and then what you basically can run instead is you basically have a couple of different interesting options. You can go with the offhand with the Albrecht's Aether Ray, right? And then you go into this, of course, and maybe you go into Siphon Souls, which, by the way, you can convert from Vitality to Aether damage, which you want to do because, oh, look, Reckless Power increases Aether damage. It makes sense. And you can go into Boil Blood, grab that Bleeding for some additional outside damage type. It's not a whole lot of bleeding, so don't rely on this. It's very weak bleeding. Mostly, you're taking Blood Boil here for the decrease in offensive ability, which just means you won't be hit as often, you won't be critted as often, which is fairly useful. It can do more for your survival than you would think just hearing about that. But it can help quite a decent bit. You don't need to, but I do find this quite helpful. So you do have that option as well. You could also go into Drain Essence instead of Albrecht's Aether Ray. And an excellent option. Maybe whether or not you have Devastation is up to you. If I'm using Drain Essence, I'm not necessarily using Devastation. I might use a shield and go quasi-tank, where I'm hitting enemies with my Drain Essence, and I'm running Drain Essence pretty much primarily, and then when the enemy gets close to me, I use Siphon Souls, and when that wears off, I blast them away with Wrath of Agrafix Calidors, and then when they get back into melee range, Siphon Souls. In the meantime, I'm draining their Essence, and you're just basically doing this cycle of Drain Essence until they're in melee, Siphon Souls, count to 3, Wrath of Agrafix. Rinse and repeat. It's the only enemies that'll be consistently attacking you will be the giant guys that are resistant to knockback, or immune to knockback as the case actually is, and ranged enemies. That's it. Those are the only ones that are really going to be a problem. And if you go into Spectral Wrath, and at the very least Spectral Wrath, you're really not going to have this problem either. Obviously, you would pull out these points here, because, you know, whether or not you have the points for Maven Sphere and Inner Focus is entirely up to you, depending on how you build, depending on if you actually go into Devastation. Sometimes I'll drop Devastation in favor of Maven Sphere, because if you'll notice, pull this out for a hot second, this is fairly pricey in terms of skill points, because you're investing so many in Necromancer. You've got Siphon Souls here, you've got Blood Boil, which, again, you don't necessarily need. You've got Spectral Wrath here. You've got Drain Essence. Right, now you've got 30 points. Yep, you could. You can still go into this fairly easily. Go into this. If you wanted Devastation, you would maybe pull points out of Blood Boil. Pull 6 out here. Actually, no, pull out the whole McCoy here. Right? Boom. Go into this, and maybe you splash your last 2 points into, I don't know, Mental Alacrity for the energy. Who knows? So you do have a couple of different options. Sometimes I'll go full Mental Alacrity, sometimes I'll go into Arcane Will instead of Devastation. It really depends on what items I have equipped, but those are the two broad ways of applying Reckless Power. Rough Reckless Power builds there. I don't usually go with Iskander's Elemental Exchange. I'm usually going as you noticed, very skill-focused, because it just really, there's a lot going on here that you can really enhance your damage output from skills. But what if you instead wanted to go into Vitality as a secondary damage type? Because I forgot I pulled these points out. Hold on 1 second. There we go. Now, you can in fact still run the very interesting Chaos damage type setup if you want. You don't need to go all the way. Well, I usually will actually, because Tainted Power. You can still run this, and you can still run this as well. I usually, if I'm going to use Harbinger of Souls focused Spellbinder, I am usually going to be melee. It's just a tendency I have. I run Spellbinder melee a lot, as you may have noticed. But a lot of the same rules really apply here. Really, the only difference here between Reckless Power and Harbinger of Souls, it comes down to whether or not you're emphasizing the elemental damage. A lot of the abilities that work under Reckless Power work under Harbinger of Souls. You're just dealing more vitality damage, so it really depends on what you feel better about. Totally up to you. I find that the Reckless Power version is a little bit more skill point manageable because you have to spend an extra 10 points to get to the Harbinger of Souls most of the time. If you intend on using Albrecht's Aether Ray, you still have to invest the full 50 here. If you don't intend on using that, that's a totally different story. But I really like Albrecht's Aether Ray with the Spellbinder because whether I go Harbinger of Souls or Reckless Power, I'm increasing that damage output. So the Reckless Power and the Harbinger of Souls do operate pretty similarly. It's just a matter of whether or not you're necessarily increasing that elemental damage with vitality damage. Now keep in mind that Harbinger of Souls does have the benefit of being a little bit more conducive to an auto-attacking focus if you want. I very rarely build that, but it's a little more powerful. Reaping Strike is a little bit better under Harbinger of Souls for the obvious reasons of both of its damage types being enhanced than the Reckless Power version. But between Harbinger of Souls and Reckless Power, it is entirely up to your preference and what damage type you want to really enhance. Technically speaking, Harbinger of Souls does a little bit more damage because you have more options for vitality damage than the Reckless Power does, because this does fire damage here, this does fire damage here, yes, but this does vitality, this does vitality, this does vitality. So you've got slightly better damage on Harbinger of Souls, but the Arcanist has an extra 10 points to play with as well. Also, if you really felt like with Harbinger of Souls, Reap Spirit is actually fairly impressive as a method of dealing large quantities of damage to a single target. The actual Wraith's damage doesn't matter, you're really using it for that initial hit of the actually sundering the Wraith out of them. This actually is fairly impressive for just that reason, especially if you happen to have Spectral Wrath. That'll help your Wraith deal more vitality damage, so that's really nice. But I don't normally talk about Reap Spirit because I really often don't like it because it only lives for 18 seconds, but in this particular circumstance, you actually have just the ability to boost that Aether damage. This is even nice to splash in for Reckless Power. I just usually prefer this with Harbinger of Souls, but it's something you can at least keep in mind. So, with that being said, also, I'm actually pointing out as well, Harbinger of Souls also makes Ravenous Earth slightly more effective than the Reckless Power if you wanted to splash that in. Again, it depends on your items. But, with that being said, thank you all very much for joining me for this. And if you liked this, please like and subscribe. And if you didn't, please ignore me. And if you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, suggestions, what have you, please leave them down in the comment section below. Thank you all very much for joining me, and have a great 24 hours.